Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Svikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram. Om Shri Vivekanandari Satshishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. Om Tavakatamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadattatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Janaha. So we will continue our reading of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna where we left off last time. And so last time we ended a day's report. And so today we begin Sunday, July 22nd, 1883. It's near the top of page 266. So July 22nd, 1883. Taking advantage of the holiday, many householder devotees visited Sri Ramakrishna in his room at the Dakshineshwar temple garden. The young devotees, mostly students, generally came on weekdays. Sometimes the master asked his intimate disciples to come on a Tuesday or a Saturday, days that he considered very auspicious for special religious instruction. Adhar, Rakal, and M had come from Calcutta in a hired carriage. So again, it being a Sunday, many people could come. As he mentions, on weekends, of course, people who had to work, which meant the householder devotees, they could come on Sundays. But weekdays, Mondays through Fridays, were days when the young men could come more easily, and Sri Ramakrishna encouraged them to come on weekdays so he could give special attention to them, because they were the future foundation of his movement. So it says that he particularly liked to have them come to him on Tuesdays and Saturdays. As many of you know, in India, every day of the week has some special significance, like Monday is sacred to Shiva. Tuesdays and Saturdays are sacred to the Divine Mother. And Sri Ramakrishna considered them very auspicious for giving deeper spiritual instruction. So he encouraged the young disciples to come at on those days. So we continue. Sri Ramakrishna had enjoyed a little rest after his midday meal. The room had an atmosphere of purity and holiness. On the walls hung pictures of gods and goddesses, among them one of Christ rescuing the drowning Peter. Outside the room were plants laden with fragrant flowers, and the Ganges could be seen flowing toward the south. The master was seated on the small couch facing the north, and the devotees sat on mats and carpets spread on the floor. All eyes were directly toward him. Mani Malik, an old Brahma devotee, about 65 years of age, came to pay his respects to the master. He had returned a few months earlier from a pilgrimage to Benares and was recounting his experiences to Sri Ramakrishna. So here, of course, as so often, M sets the scene by describing the day, describing the room, describing the garden, the Ganges, etc. And all of that is for the purpose of carrying us in imagination to that time and place so that we can relive the experience that he had, recreating it as far as he could with words. And it says that Mani Malik, an old Brahmo devotee, had come to see Sri Ramakrishna and was telling him about his recent trip to Benares, a pilgrimage. So we continue. Mani Malik. A monk whom I met in Benares said that no religious experience is possible without the control of the sense organs. Nothing could be achieved by merely crying, God, God. And so that, of course, is standard teaching that all of us have heard, that one has to practice self-control before one can attain to God. In a limited way for the general householder, and then in a more severe way, or a more strict way, I should say, for the monastics. But to some extent, the control of the organs is necessary. But Sri Ramakrishna heard in Mani Malik's words something more. Just as Swami Vivekananda, as Narendranath, as a student, when he was still Narendranath, he got to the point where in reading a book, he could read the first line of a page, the first and last line of a page, and understand the content of the whole page. That sounds miraculous, but it's not miraculous. It's because his mind was so highly developed that when he saw the first and last sentence, he could understand where the first sentence was going and where the last sentence, what it had ended. And so he could intuit the train of thought. It wasn't by some mystical power going to some other realm or reading someone's mind or something like that. No, it was simply the extremely sharpened intellect which is able to perceive the chain of cause and effect even when huge links in that chain are missing. But from one link to a later link, one can understand what would have gone in between. So like that, Sri Ramakrishna, hearing Mani Malik telling about the teaching of this sadhu, saying that one, to have spiritual experience, one must practice self-control. And Sri Ramakrishna was always advising self-control too. But again, because he saw something more in the words of the sadhu, or he understood from this very short report of Mani Malik, he understood the background of the sadhu's ideas. And so instead of saying, yes, that's true, or how wonderful, he says, do you understand the views of teachers like him? According to them, one must first practice spiritual discipline, self-restraint, self-control, forbearance, and the like. Their aim is to attain nirvana. They are followers of Vedanta. They constantly discriminate, saying, Brahman alone is real, the world is illusory. But this is an extremely difficult path. If the world is illusory, then you too are illusory. The teacher who gives the instruction is equally illusory. His words too are as illusory as a dream. But this experience is beyond the reach of ordinary man. Do you know what it is like? If you burn camphor, nothing remains. When wood is burnt, at least a little ash is left, but with camphor, nothing is left. Finally, after the last analysis, the devotee goes into samadhi. Then he knows nothing whatsoever of I, you, or the universe. So like camphor burning itself completely up, The I attaining to samadhi is burnt up. That is the higher samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi, equivalent to nirvana. Then nothing of the I, the you, the universe, nothing remains. And he continues, Padmalochan was a man of deep wisdom. He had great respect for me, though at that time I constantly repeated the name of the Divine Mother. He was the court pandit of the Maharaja of Burdwan. Once he came to Calcutta and went to live in a garden house near Kamarhati. I felt a desire to see him and sent Hriday there to learn if the pandit had any vanity. I was told that he had none. Then I met him. Though a man of great knowledge and scholarship, he began to weep on hearing me sing Ram Prasad's devotional songs. We talked together a long while. Conversation with nobody else gave me such satisfaction. He said to me, give up the desire for the company of devotees. Otherwise, people of all sorts will come to you and make you deviate from your spiritual ideal. Once he entered into a controversy by correspondence with Utsavananda, that was a Vaishnava sadhu. Utsavananda, Vaishnav Charan's guru, a Vaishnava who was the guru of the great Pandit Vaishnav Charan. He told me an interesting incident. That is, Padmalochan told me an interesting incident. Once a meeting was called to decide which of the two deities, Shiva or Brahma, was the greater. Unable to come to any decision, the Pandits at last referred the matter to Padmalochan. With characteristic guilelessness, he said, how do I know? Neither I nor any of my ancestors back to 14 generations have seen Shiva or Brahma. About the renunciation of woman and gold, he said to me one day, why have you given up those things? Such distinctions as this is money and this is clay are the outcome of ignorance. But what could I say to that? I replied, I don't know all these things, my dear sir, but for my part, I cannot relish such things as money and the like. So here, this was a long but very rich paragraph, so let's go into it a little further. He talks about Padmalochan, a pandit, a scholar, who was very dear to Ramakrishna, who became very dear to him, very close to him. As he says here in what we just read, he enjoyed talking to no one as much as he enjoyed talking to Padmalochan. And so this was at a time when also he used to go to see Keshav Chandra Sen, whom he loved very much too. But Padmalochan gave him a special joy, and no doubt because he was both a scholar and he was a sincere devotee. So he says that had heard about him and wanted to meet him, and that we've seen many times in the gospel and in the life of Sri Ramakrishna, and I've mentioned it many times here in this class, how Sri Ramakrishna would seek out greatness wherever he found it or wherever he heard of it, and he himself would go to see and to pay respect to such people, whether it was a great musician, a great singer, a great pandit, a man of great charity like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, or pandits like Padmalochan. So he wanted to test the pandit before going to see him, to see if it was worth his while to go see him. So he wanted to see whether the pandit had vanity, because his experience and all of our experience is that often when a person gets panditya, that is scholarship, then they become vain. They become full of themselves. As Sri Ramakrishna would mimic, they sit in a certain style, puffed up with pride, and take a pinch of snuff in those days, and then begin to discourse in a grand way, quite full of themselves and full of the image they are creating for themselves. So he wanted to see, is this a pandit of wisdom or a pandit of ego? And so he sent Hriday to test him, and Hriday came back and said, no, there's no vanity in this man. So Sri Ramakrishna went and indeed found that was so. As he says in what we read, he sang some songs of Ram Prasad, and Padmalochan would weep tears of devotion. So we always have to remember that this praising of weeping and devotion, it doesn't mean that this was weak sentimentality. No, that kind of, if we cry too easily, then we need to strengthen ourselves. But a person, through devotion, also through sincere devotion, is brought to tears of devotion, not tears of sadness, not even tears of repentance. Those have their place. But this is these tears of devotion. And Padmalochan had those. So interesting set of instructions that Padmalochan gave to Sri Ramakrishna and arguments that he gave to him. He said, give up the desire for the company of devotees. Otherwise, people of all sorts will come to you and make you deviate from your spiritual ideal. So now that was good advice. Again, as I always say when teaching the Gita and we come to Arjuna and what we know to be Arjuna's weaknesses, well, we know that they are Arjuna's weaknesses because we know the story of the Gita and how it turns out. But Arjuna, actually, his arguments are quite sensible from an ordinary standpoint. And so here also, this advice of Padmalochan is quite good, quite sound, and based on experience. And that we tell our brothers in our own Ramakrishna order when we see that someone is getting too involved with the public, going out all of the time to eat and to move around with people and chit-chat and generally socializing too much. Then they are warned that, look, brother, you should restrain yourself. You shouldn't go out so much because people come to see you because you're a holy man. But if you're always acting like them, then you lose your holiness, and who is going to come to see whom? So you have to preserve your spiritual practice, your spiritual demeanor, your spiritual focus. Otherwise, you've lost everything. And so, this is good advice from Padmalochan. However, he didn't, though he had great regard for Sri Ramakrishna and came to regard him as an incarnation of God also, but he didn't know fully who Sri Ramakrishna was, what he was, and what the aim of his coming was. Sri Ramakrishna had come for the devotees. He had come to uplift people, and ordinary sadhus and even ordinary spiritually great people have to be careful of the company they keep, the associations they keep, etc., because it influences us. It influences all of us. But with Sri Ramakrishna, he was beyond that. He was, in the analogy he himself used with Totapuri, he was like a golden vessel. It doesn't tarnish. It doesn't pick up tarnish from the environment. It remains shining, shining as gold. And so Sri Ramakrishna had come for the very purpose of enjoying life with the devotees. As we know, when his mind would go too high, the tendency of his mind was always to go into samadhi, but he would use a variety of means to pull his mind back. And sometimes, as he was coming out of samadhi, arguing with the mother to let him go and to let him come back to be with the devotees, because that was the very purpose of his birth. He didn't need to be born. We're born because we have to be. We have no choice. It's not that someone comes and asks, well, would you like to be born or not be born? And we take a few days to think it over and then give our answer. No, we find ourselves born by the force of karma. There's no, it's a necessity, a necessary link in the chain of causation. But with Sri Ramakrishna, he's ever free. Not that he was ever free, he is ever free. And so his taking birth is a matter of divine choice, you could say, part of the divine lila. taking birth not because there was any karmic necessity to it, but as a response to the needs of the time, out of compassion, and with, as Swami Vivekananda explains, with full knowledge. We come into the world weeping, crying, and not understanding where we've come or why. And we spend the rest of our lives trying to figure that out. But with the Sri Ramakrishna and such great souls as he, they're born not because of necessity, not because of desire, but out of compassion, as a response of the divine heart, the mother heart of the universe, to human suffering. And so he was always trying to keep his mind on this plane where he could talk to, interact with, guide, and teach the devotees. And so he had no need for such instruction from Padmalochan. But again, when we read the gospel and read such things, it's easy to immediately think, well, how presumptuous it was of Padmalochan to give Sri Ramakrishna that instruction. But no, it was good instruction. And Sri Ramakrishna didn't, of course, react as he never would have reacted in any situation, with ego. And none of that, oh, how dare you say that to me? Do you know who I am? Do you know why I was born? Do you know how free I am from all of that? None of that. He just says, well, I don't know what you say, but as for me, those things don't appeal to me. So then he tells this famous story that I'm sure most of you have heard, a famous story of those who are familiar with the life and teachings of Ramakrishna, about the meeting that was called to decide whether Shiva or Brahma was the greatest of the deities. Now this, just as Sri Ramakrishna, not just as, I'm not claiming equality of Sri Ramakrishna, but in a much lower way, the same process, as Sri Ramakrishna could hear one sentence from Mani Malik and understand the trend of the teacher, the sadhu's mind, or as Swami Vivekananda could read the first and last sentences on a page and understand the trend of thought in the whole page in a much less intense way, a more normal way. It's easy to see that this was an argument between Vaishnavas. Why? Because Vishnu is not mentioned. And when Vishnu is not mentioned, they're assuming that Vishnu is beyond compare. There's no need to bring Vishnu into the conversation. He's beyond compare. So is Shiva or Brahma the greater of the secondary tier of gods according to the Vaishnavas? What's another indication that that's what's going on here? Brahma has no votaries in India. There is no sect of people who worship Brahma, the creator. Brahma is a minor figure in the Hindu pantheon. And so there's nobody that's going to say, it's not like there were followers of Shiva and followers of Brahma arguing about which is greater and which is lesser. No, it's somebody who is looking from outside to look at these, comparing these two as similar and comparing which one is greater and which one is lesser. So thereby we can be sure that this was an argument among Vaishnavas who had already assumed that Vishnu was far beyond any contest. The contest was among secondary deities in their mind, like Shiva and Brahma. So, but Padmalochan's answer is wonderful. That he doesn't enter into an explanation. He doesn't go to the scriptures and quote different texts. He doesn't give some philosophical explanation and say that, well, all deities are actually the same because they're all manifestations of the same Brahman and all of that, which especially in a Vaishnava context, that wouldn't have impressed anyone anyway. And so instead of going into any mental gymnastics to try to explain it, he doesn't try to explain it at all. He just says simply that I have met neither of the two deities, nor anyone in my 14 generations of ancestors ever saw Shiva or Brahma. And so I don't know. So wisdom of that answer, first of all, it avoids useless arguments which many people are not going to accept anyway. That's why they were arguing, because the argument doesn't resolve an issue. And so more argument wouldn't help. And he doesn't claim to know, but he shows by his example of humility that the argument is useless, that you are arguing about something that you haven't seen, something that you haven't known. So admit your humility, admit your ignorance, and go from there. But trying to establish through argumentation whether Shiva or Brahma is greater, that's a ridiculous exercise. So anyway, so it's a justly famous incident in the life of Padmalochan that he told to Sri Ramakrishna. And then also Sri Ramakrishna tells about his other advice about woman and gold. Is why do you renounce these things? Everything is God, everything is Brahman. So it's ignorance to make this distinction between clay and money. So that, of course, is referring to the fact that Sri Ramakrishna couldn't touch money and he couldn't touch gold. In fact, in many years of his life, he couldn't touch metal of any kind because different types of metal were used in coins. And so Padmalochan was saying, and again, that's a sensible advice from one standpoint, that if Sri Ramakrishna knew that everything was Brahman, so why was he still averse to even touching money? But to Sri Ramakrishna, again, in this case, Sri Ramakrishna doesn't argue with him. He just says, I don't know all these things, my dear sir, but for my part, I can't relish such things as money and the like. So he was, of course, as Sri Ramakrishna said at the beginning of this particular incident, Padmalochan was talking about both gold and sex, lust, and why Sri Ramakrishna had given up both of these things. So Sri Ramakrishna only mentioned the money part, but the other was part of what Padmalochan was telling him, that if everything is God, if everything is Brahman, then what's the problem with these things? So Sri Ramakrishna, of course, the simple answer about why he couldn't touch money, it was because he had given it up. And his mind was so strong that having given something up, there was no way that he could take it back. That was a sign of the strength of his mind. It was not, as Padmalochan thought, a sign of the weakness of his realization. That, well, when everything is Brahman, then you don't need to follow that anymore. No, Sri Ramakrishna had given it up once and for all and didn't want anything to do with it. The very idea of touching money couldn't come to him. It had gone into his nerves, as it were, as a nervous memory, so that he couldn't, even by accident, couldn't touch money. And that's one of the things we see that's wonderful in Sri Ramakrishna, is that he reduced every idea into a concrete practice. So he would not be satisfied just with understanding the mental idea and dealing with the mental idea at the abstract level. He would reduce every teaching into a concrete practice, like cleaning up after the eating of the low-caste people or outcast people, the sweepers and others at the Dakshineshwar temple, carrying their leaf plates on his head, even touching the food that they had eaten with his tongue, cleaning out their latrines with his own hair. All of these extreme practices which he carried out in order to get rid of the idea that I am better, higher, more worthy than anyone, to get completely rid of that ego. So he reduced everything to a practice, and with money, there was no way that he could touch it because he had given it up. When later an Ayurvedic physician began to treat him for what was the first signs of his cancer of the throat, the physician told him that he couldn't take any water for a certain amount of time. And so then Sri Ramakrishna said that it was impossible for him to drink water. Not that he tried, but once he had made that determination, I want to drink water for the length of the time the doctor has said, when he would put water in his mouth to rinse his mouth out, his throat would of itself constrict so that water couldn't go down, even by mistake. And he told people who prepared his food, when you rinse off the pomegranate seeds to serve to me, dry them off before you give them to me. So there's no water even clinging to the pomegranate seeds. So again, that's why, even though, yes, he was beyond temptation, he knew, he saw, he didn't know, he saw everything as God, nothing but God. But I've given up money, I can't touch it. That's over. So he continues, Sri Ramakrishna, there was a Pandit who was tremendously vain. He did not believe in the forms of God. But who can understand the inscrutable ways of the divine? God revealed himself to him as the primal power, the Adya Shakti, primal power. This vision made the Pandit unconscious for a long time. After regaining partial consciousness, he uttered only the sound ka, ka, ka. He could not fully pronounce Kali. So he was trying to repeat the name of the Divine Mother. So that's a beautiful story. I don't know who that Pandit was, but a Pandit who was very vain and didn't believe in the forms of gods and goddesses, who had the vision of the primal power, meaning Adya Shakti, meaning the Divine Mother. And so he must have seen the Divine Mother as Kali, because he was trying to repeat her name as he was in ecstasy, but he could only get out Ka. A devotee, sir, you met Pandit Vidyasagar. What did you think of him? So that we read about Pandit Vidyasagar and Sri Ramakrishna's meeting earlier in the Gospel. It's a beautiful passage where again Sri Ramakrishna, hearing of his great scholarship and his great charity, he wanted to see him, so he sought out Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. He's still famous in India after much more than 100 years of his death. He's still famous in West Bengal. And when I was in India, we studied his Bakaran Kaumudi, his book in Bengali, teaching Sanskrit through the Bengali medium. So he was famous as a scholar. He wrote children's primers, he wrote this grammar and many other things, but he was an educator, a man of great charity. And anyone who went to him with any need, he would try to fill their need, because he himself had grown up in terrible poverty. He had to study sitting in the street under a street lamp, which in those days was an oil light or a gas light. But sitting under the street light, he would hold his book and study, because there was no electricity in the house, and not even any oil to put in a lamp. He was so poor. But he became this great Pandit and a man of wealth who used his wealth in charity, giving it as it came, giving it away to the poor and to anyone who needed. So this devotee asks, I hear that you saw Vidyasagar. So the master said, Vidyasagar has both scholarship and charity, but he lacks inner vision. Gold lies hidden within him. Had he but found it out, his activities would have been reduced. Finally, they would have stopped altogether. Had he but known that God resides in his heart, his mind would have been directed to God in thought and meditation. Some persons must perform selfless work a long time before they can practice dispassion and direct their minds to the spiritual ideal, and at last be absorbed in God. So here, Sri Ramakrishna gives an honest appraisal of Vidyasagar, whom he admired. That's why he went to see him, and whom he thought well of. But Sri Ramakrishna was all of his life, he was setting an ideal. And in setting an ideal, it's necessary that we know what is good and what is not good. And so he speaks, gives a very honest appraisal of him here, saying that he is a man of great charity and of great scholarship, but he lacks inner vision. That he mentions, in fact, Sri Ramakrishna, when he went to see Vidyasagar, he told him that you have gold inside of you. All you have to do is change the direction of your attention and find that which is within. But Vidyasagar couldn't do it, at least not as far as we know. Maybe surely Sri Ramakrishna's visit had some influence on him. Maybe it had enough so at the end of his life, his mind began to turn inward. I don't know. But at the time, it had not. And so Sri Ramakrishna indicates that he was a good person. The gold is inside all of us. But for most of us, it's not just a question of turning the mind within. But he saw that Vidyasagar had become a good person, a unselfish person through his charity. And so with some effort, he could turn his mind within. The famous British physicist, English physicist of the first half of the 20th century, Sir Arthur Eddington. He was a great physicist, well known in the 20th century. He's less well known nowadays, but a very, very great scientist. And he went to India. It must have been in the late 20s or early 30s, late 1920s or early 1930s. And there he met Swami Shivananda Mahapurush Maharaj, the disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, who at that time was president of the order. And so he had a meeting with him, spoke with him, and then came out. And then the attendants on Swami Shivananda asked him about Sir Arthur Eddington. And he says, Swami Shivananda said that his mind has become very clear. All he needs to do is to turn it within, and quickly he will get spiritual experience. So he could see that Sir Arthur Eddington, though he was not a spiritual aspirant, he was a scientist. But because of the intensity of the concentration he had developed, the purity of his intention, his sincerity in the search for knowledge, his renunciation of other interests and so forth, his mind had become very clear. So it was just a matter of turning the direction of his mind. In fact, there's an interesting sequel to that. Someone asked an Indian, in fact, an Indian scientist, or maybe an Indian student of science, I don't know who it was or how old he was, once asked Albert Einstein if Einstein had any experience or intuition of the absolute. And Einstein said, no, I haven't. But speak to Arthur Eddington. He has, Sir Arthur Eddington, he has. So obviously in Einstein's estimation, Sir Arthur Eddington had some intuition of the divine that he knew about, and so directed the student to him. We don't know what happened, if the student ever got to speak to Sir Arthur Eddington or not, but that's a very interesting sequel to what Swami Shivananda had said. And so Sri Ramakrishna says about Vidyasagar that you just have to there's gold within, just turn your attention towards it, and you will find it. But at least at this time, he had not done so. Some persons must perform selfless work a long time, in what we already read, before they can practice dispassion and direct their minds to the spiritual ideal. So yes, many of us have to work for a long time until the work itself begins to fall away. He says, Sri Ramakrishna continues with that idea. The activities that Vidyasagar is engaged in are good. Charity is very noble. There is a great deal of difference between daya, compassion, and maya, attachment. Daya is good, but not maya. Maya is love for one's own relatives, one's wife, children, brother, sister, nephew, father, and mother. But daya is the same love for all created beings, without any distinction. And so here again, he's praising Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. that he is very charitable, he's engaged in charity, and that charity is good, that daya is contrary to maya, that maya, illusion, consists in being attached to everything that is personal. So he puts it in terms, because he's comparing it to daya, compassion, he puts it in terms of human relationship. So Maya means my people, my son, my daughter, my husband, my wife, my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents, my etc. All my people, focusing my love exclusively, my interest, my hopes for their welfare on my own immediate family members. So daya is contrary to that. Daya is equal love for all, equal feeling for all, the ability to feel the experiences of others as one's own, their sufferings as well as their joys. And so M asks at this point, is daya also a bondage? Master, yes, it is. But that concept is something far beyond the ordinary man. Daya springs from sattva. Sattva preserves, rajas creates, and tamas destroys. But Brahman is beyond the three gunas. It is beyond prakriti. So is daya, compassion, is that a bondage? And so here Sri Ramakrishna says, ultimately it is, but basically what he's saying is that's not something you have to worry about now. Daya, compassion, becomes an obstacle when it's the last thing holding us to this world and not able to plunge completely into God. So that's not our problem. As I've said on occasion in the Ashtavakra Samhita, Ashtavakra, the guru, teaches his disciple King Janaka that this alone is your bondage, that you still practice samadhi. And that's not our problem. That's a problem for someone who has attained to the limits of spiritual experience. And yet they go on practicing rather than just surrendering into the infinite and becoming the infinite. They've attained to samadhi, but they go on practicing samadhi, as was the case with Totapuri. That was the instruction Sri Ramakrishna gave to Totapuri, who had attained to Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And Sri Ramakrishna asked him, why do you still practice meditation so arduously and with regularity? And Totapuri said, if I don't polish my kamandalu, my brass kamandalu, then it will get tarnished. And Sri Ramakrishna said, but if the kamandalu is made of gold, then no tarnish can stick to it. Meaning that one who has attained to perfection becomes made of gold, and then they have no fear of tarnish. And that, of course, was Sri Ramakrishna's own state. So he says that sattva preserves in the triple cosmic action of creation, preservation, and then destruction. We see that at the cosmic scale, where there's the creation of the universe, there's the preservation, which is going on even now, and then the eventual destruction of the universe, when the universe collapses in on itself after many billions of years. And that's happening on a small scale everywhere. Everything, the cells are constantly being created that is born from other cells. They're preserved for some time, and then they die to be replaced by more cells. Everything is happening that way: creation, preservation, and destruction. So sattva is the guna which governs preservation, because it's the guna of equilibrium, transparency, clarity, etc., stability, etc. Whereas rajas is identified with creation, because rajas is the guna of passion, of action, passion, action and reaction, etc. And then tamas is destruction, the quality of destruction. He says that, however, Brahman is beyond the three gunas, beyond prakriti, prakriti meaning, of course, nature in its totality. all levels of creation, all levels of objectivity. So none of the three gunas can reach truth. They are like robbers who cannot come to a public place for fear of being arrested. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas are like so many thieves. So now he tells that famous story, and I'll end with this story about the three thieves, illustrating the action and nature of the three gunas. So he says, listen to a story. Once a man was going through a forest when three robbers fell upon him and robbed him of all his possessions. One of the robbers said, "What's the use of keeping this man alive?" So saying, he was about to kill him with his sword, when the second robber interrupted him, saying, "Oh no, what's the use of killing him? Tie him hand and foot and just leave him here." The robbers bound his hands and feet and went away. After a while, the third robber returned and said to the man, "Ah, I am sorry. Are you hurt? I'll release you from your bonds." After setting the man free, the thief said, "Come with me. I will take you to the public highway." After a long time, they reached the road. Then the robber said, "Follow this road. Over there is your house." At this, the man said, "Sir, you have been very good to me. Come with me to my house." "Oh, no," the robber replied. "I can't go there. The police will know it." And then he continues his explanation. This world itself is the forest. The three robbers prowling here are Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. It is they that rob a man of the knowledge of truth. Tamas wants to destroy him. Rajas binds him to the world, but Sattva rescues him from the clutches of Rajas and Tamas. Under the protection of Sattva, man is rescued from anger, passion, and other evil effects of Tamas. Further, Sattva loosens the bonds of the world, but Sattva also is a robber. It cannot give him the ultimate knowledge of truth, though it shows him the road towards the supreme abode of God. Seeing him on the path, Sattva tells him, "Look yonder, there is your home." Even Sattva is far away from the knowledge of Brahman. What Brahman is cannot be described. Even he who knows it cannot talk about it. There is a saying that a boat, once reaching the black waters of the ocean, cannot come back. So here the story, of course, the meaning I think is obvious. As Sri Ramakrishna explains, the forest is this world, and the robbers are the three gunas. And the man walking in the forest who's accosted, he represents us, the jiva, the individual soul. And so the first robber says, let's kill him. We take what he's got and let's kill him. And so that represents tamas, the destructive power of tamas, that which is inertia, darkness, confusion, delusion, and destruction. And so then another thief intervenes and says, no need to kill him. Let's just tie him hand and foot. So then he can't get away, then we won't be accused of murder. So we just tie him hands and foot and just leave him here to his own devices. So they did that. So that, of course, represents Rajas, because it's Rajas, the passions and strong emotions and the sense of me and mine, the pride that comes from a strong ego and attachment, aversion. All of those are qualities of Rajas. The guna of action and reaction, and passionate action and reaction. So that binds us. It's Rajas that ties us down. Tamas deludes us and eventually destroys us. Rajas binds us down. But Sattva is the third thief who comes to the man and says, "You poor man, you must be suffering. I'll untie you. And come with me, I'll show you the way back to your city." And he takes him to the highway and points, "Your house is just over there. Go there and you'll know where you are." And so Sattva does that. Sattva takes us towards liberation. That's why we try to cultivate Sattva, the quality of equanimity, the quality of tranquility, the quality of inner balance and harmony, the quality of understanding, transparency of mind and understanding. All of these are the qualities which we try to cultivate because they lead us towards God. But they can't take us there either. There comes a point where we have to go beyond all of the gunas. So the guna of sattva, that is felt when the mind begins to become pure and clear. Because the buddhi itself in all of us have a buddhi, the highest intuitive part of the mind, that is made of sattva. And so when we become sattvic, then the buddhi is in its pure original state and it can function freely. So we try to seek the establishment in sattva so that we can get to the point where we can begin to see truth. We're seeing it from a distance because we're still seeing it from the mind, the sattvic part of the mind. But we can see it. And now it's just a question of learning to leave the mind behind. That won't make any sense to us right now. And it can't make sense to us because we haven't gotten to a point where we can understand what that means. But when we become purely sattvic, then we will see. As the Yoga Sutras say, Patanjali says in his Yoga Sutras, that when the mind becomes completely transparent, that is perfectly sattvic, then we see the distinction between consciousness and everything else, the distinction between consciousness and nature, that is objectivity. So he concludes it by saying that what Brahman is cannot be described, that one who has attained to it can't talk about it. And we know from Sri Ramakrishna's life that a number of times he would, and some of them are mentioned in here in the gospel, he would come out of samadhi and want to tell the disciples what he had experienced, but he would try and he couldn't. So he would say, it feels as if the Divine Mother is grasping my throat, not allowing me to speak. But we can understand that what that meant was that there were no words to explain it. It was not that he was about to tell a secret that the Divine Mother didn't want to get out. Don't tell them that or the whole play is ruined. No, not like that. He was trying to explain something that was beyond description. And so he saw everything as happening through the action of the Divine Mother, that she was she was activity itself. And so the attempt to explain it and the complete lack of any ability to explain it, he saw as the mother preventing him from explaining it. But again, he saw everything as the Divine Mother's action. So I think we will stop here. Next is another one of his famous parables. So we'll come to that next time. And I'll give announcements now and then see if there are any questions. So on Sunday, there will be a talk at the usual time, 11 o'clock, on the non-dualism of Sri Ramakrishna. So I'll be speaking about Sri Ramakrishna in honor of his birth anniversary, which was this past Monday, the 15th, and which we celebrated last Sunday, the 14th. So I'll speak on him on Sunday. The next week, the classes will continue as usual, except that the Gita, we have finished our study of the Gita, and so we will begin the study of the Upanishads. We'll take up first the Isha Upanishad this coming Thursday at the usual time of, this coming Tuesday at the usual time of 7:30 p.m. So Tuesday, 7:30 p.m., Isha Upanishad begins. And this gospel class will continue next Thursday as always. And there are no special announcements right now. Are there any questions? No questions. Okay, so then I'll give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anandarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhృతvigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat.